Everyone stand for the Admiral." The words cracked through the chapel like cannon fire. For half a second, nobody moved. Then 300 people surged to their feet all at once, chairs scraping polished hardwood crystal glasses, trembling on white linen tables. The organist froze mid-note. Across the room, my father's face drained of color. His mouth hung open, the same mouth that had spent 35 years telling me I'd never amount to much if I kept playing soldier. And there I stood in the center aisle of St. Matthew's Chapel in Charleston, South Carolina, my white navy dress uniform catching the candlelight, 4 silver stars gleaming on my shoulders. For the first time in my life, my father had nothing to say. But to understand why that silence mattered, you have to understand the kind of man Walter Mercer had always been. And the kind of daughter he never wanted. It had started 3 hours earlier at the rehearsal dinner. Charleston in late spring always feels dipped in honey. Warm air drifted through the open windows of the Harbor Club ballroom, carrying the scent of salt water and magnolia blossoms from the Battery. The city had dressed itself beautifully for our wedding weekend. Inside, crystal chandeliers glowed over 24 round tables draped in ivory linen, gold-rimmed china, tall floral centerpieces of white roses and eucalyptus. The sort of expensive Southern elegance my mother had spent 6 months arranging down to the last folded napkin. My fiancé Daniel Whitaker had wanted something smaller. But my father insisted, if my daughter's finally doing something respectable with her life, he'd announced we ought to make it worth seeing. He'd said it smiling. People laughed. That was Walter Mercer's gift. He could humiliate you while sounding charming enough that everyone thought they were supposed to laugh. I stood near the ballroom entrance, smoothing the front of my white dress jacket. It was formal navy issue immaculate, pressed to perfection, brass buttons polished bright enough to reflect light. And yes, the 4 stars were there. I'd earned every one of them. The official public announcement had only come 2 days earlier. Most of Washington already knew. So did Navy leadership. My family had not. Mostly because none of them ever asked about my career beyond whether I planned to settle down soon. I'd told Daniel months ago I wasn't sure about wearing the uniform to our rehearsal dinner. He'd taken both my hands and smiled that quiet, steady smile that made everything feel possible. "Claire," he said, "you gave 30 years to this country. Don't spend your wedding weekend pretending that part of you doesn't exist." I loved him for that. Still do. That evening I'd stood in the mirror upstairs, staring at my reflection longer than usual. 34 years old, hair pinned neatly at the nape of my neck, minimal makeup, a face lined not by age but by responsibility. The sort of face command gives you. Not glamorous, not soft enough for my mother's standards, not polished and sparkling like my younger sister Vanessa, who had inherited every ounce of Southern beauty my father valued. I looked like what I was. A woman who had spent most of her adult life carrying burdens heavier than herself and learning how not to bend under them. When I entered the ballroom, conversation dipped. Heads turned. And for one brief, impossible moment, I thought maybe my father would finally look at me and feel pride. Instead, he laughed. Not loudly. Just enough. He was standing near the bar, bourbon in hand, perfectly tailored navy blazer stretched over his broad frame. At 68, Walter Mercer still looked imposing, silver at the temples, square-jawed, the kind of man who made people listen the second he entered a room. He gave me a slow once-over and smirked. "You're actually wearing your uniform." The nearby guests turned toward us. I forced a small smile. "Yes, sir." He chuckled and shook his head. "God, Claire, at your own wedding rehearsal? How embarrassing." A few people laughed politely. Vanessa perched beside him in pale pink silk, pressed manicured fingers to her lips to hide her grin. Oh, Daddy let her have her little moment. Little moment. Funny phrase for 30 years of service. My mother glanced down at her wineglass. She said nothing. She rarely ever did. I felt heat rise into my chest, but years in command had taught me how to let anger settle cold. I walked closer, met my father's eyes, and said evenly, "I'll wear what I earned." That sharpened his expression. Walter Mercer didn't like resistance. Not from employees, not from my mother. Certainly not from me. "You always did enjoy making people uncomfortable," he said. I smiled faintly. "No, Dad. I just stopped making myself smaller so you could feel bigger." The silence around us deepened. Vanessa's smile faltered. My mother looked up sharply. And for the first time all evening, my father looked uncertain. Only for a second. Then he scoffed and turned back toward the bar. "Well," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "let's hope tomorrow your little costume doesn't distract from the bride." There it was. The final reminder. Even at my own wedding in his mind, I was still a child playing dress-up. Not a woman. Not a leader. Not someone worth seeing clearly. Daniel appeared at my side, then warm hand slipping gently into mine. "You okay?" I looked up at him. His calm gray eyes held mine steady as open water, and something inside me settled. "Yes," I said, because suddenly, strangely, for the first time I realized I didn't need my father's approval to walk forward. Tomorrow I would step into St. Matthew's Chapel exactly as I was. No apology, no explanation. And whether Walter Mercer understood what those 4 stars meant or not, someone in that room would. I had no idea just how right that feeling was, or that before the next evening ended, my father's entire understanding of his daughter would collapse in front of 300 witnesses. I barely slept that night, not because of nerves about the wedding, and not because of what my father had said at the rehearsal dinner. After 30 years in uniform, words had long ago stopped being able to wound me the way they once had. Experience teaches you that people can only diminish your worth if you hand them the authority to define it. Still, old habits linger, and Walter Mercer had spent a lifetime teaching me to doubt what I'd earned. I woke just after 4:30 to the familiar stillness that always comes before dawn. The Whitaker estate sat on a stretch of old Charleston waterfront where the Ashley River caught first light like brushed silver. Daniel's family had owned the property for generations, a sprawling federal-style home with broad porches, ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss, and enough history in its walls to make silence feel sacred. I stood at the bedroom window in my robe and watched the sky lighten. For years, mornings like this had belonged to deployments. Quiet preparation, mental inventory, breathing slow and steady before responsibility settled onto your shoulders for another day. Funny how your body remembers duty even when your life is changing. Today I was getting married, and somehow that felt more intimidating than any command transfer I'd ever accepted. Behind me, Daniel stirred beneath the covers. "You're up early," he murmured. I smiled. "I've been accused of worse." He rolled onto one elbow, his sandy hair unruly from sleep, his expression still carrying that boyish kindness that had first disarmed me 6 years earlier at a Navy fundraiser in Annapolis. Daniel Whitaker had the unusual gift of making space feel calm. It was one of the reasons I'd fallen in love with him. He looked at me for a moment, then sat up straighter. "You're thinking about him." I didn't have to ask who. "Yes." Daniel nodded once. Then he pulled back the covers and crossed the room barefoot, stopping beside me at the window. For a while, neither of us spoke. Outside, the first gulls drifted over the water. Finally, he said quietly, "Claire, you know he's wrong." I gave a small laugh. "I know." "Then why does it still hurt?" That question stayed between us for several seconds. Because it was honest. And because Daniel had always known how to ask the questions I usually avoided answering. I folded my arms. Because part of me still keeps waiting for him to become the father I thought he might be someday. Daniel's reflection softened in the glass. That little girl deserved better. I closed my eyes briefly. Yes, she did. I was 8 the first time I understood my father wished I'd been someone else. Vanessa had just won Little Miss Charleston. My mother had thrown a celebration dinner with neighbors and church friends. Everyone praised her curls, her smile, her poise. At some point, I'd run into the dining room holding my science fair ribbon. 2nd place. I'd been so proud. "Daddy, look what I won." He barely glanced over, then smiled absently and said, "That's nice, sweetheart, but don't interrupt your sister's moment." Everyone had laughed softly, not cruelly, just enough for an 8-year-old girl to understand she'd misunderstood her place. That was Walter Mercer's way. He didn't shout often, didn't rage, didn't strike. He simply withheld warmth with such precision that you spent years trying to earn what was never coming. Vanessa fit his world beautifully. She was graceful, social adored attention the way flowers adore sunlight. And to be fair, she wasn't cruel by nature. She simply learned early that my failures made her shine brighter. Children adapt to whatever love rewards. I adapted differently. I stopped seeking applause and started chasing competence. Grades, athletics, leadership. Then Annapolis. The day my acceptance letter arrived, my mother cried. Vanessa clapped politely. My father looked over his reading glasses and said, "The military, Claire, that's hardly a future for a woman." I was 17, and for reasons I still don't fully understand, something inside me hardened cleanly in that moment. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "Then I suppose I'll have to build one." It was the first honest thing I ever said to him. He never forgave me for it. At 8 sharp, there was a knock at the door. Daniel smiled. "Your cavalry." I opened it to find Margaret Whittaker Daniels' mother holding a silver tray with coffee and toast. She wore soft blue linen and the kind of warm smile only women who've truly lived can give. Well, she said America's most intimidating bride looks underfed. I laughed despite myself. Margaret stepped inside and set the tray down. Then her expression gentled. "Claire, may I tell you something?" "Of course." She touched my arm lightly. "When Daniel first told us about you, my father Thomas asked what branch you served in. The second he heard your name, he went quiet." I frowned. "Why?" Margaret smiled carefully. "He said he wanted to meet you before explaining." That gave me pause. Thomas Whittaker was 82 and one of the most decorated retired admirals in modern Navy history. He'd commanded fleets before I'd even graduated high school. I'd met him only twice before. Each time he'd looked at me with a curious intensity I hadn't understood. Before I could ask more, Margaret simply said, "Wear your uniform proudly today." Then she left, and somehow those words steadied me more than she probably knew. By noon, I stood alone in the dressing room at St. Matthew's Chapel. The white dress blues fit perfectly. Every seam exact, every brass button polished. The 4 stars rested on my shoulders with the quiet weight of sacrifice. They weren't decoration. They were memory. Lives lost. Lives saved. Years carried. 1,000 impossible decisions no one would ever know I'd made. I studied my reflection. Not as Walter Mercer's daughter. Not as someone still hoping to be chosen. But as the woman I had become despite him. Then the chapel bells began to ring. It was time. And as I reached for the door, I had the strangest certainty that before this day ended, my father would finally see exactly who had been standing in front of him all along. There are moments in life when time does something strange. It slows. The world sharpens. And you know without understanding how that what happens next will divide your life into before and after. That was how it felt standing outside the doors of St. Matthew's Chapel. The bells had just finished ringing. Inside, 300 guests were settling into polished oak pews beneath vaulted ceilings that had stood over Charleston for nearly 2 centuries. Candlelight shimmered against stained glass windows. White roses lined the aisle. Somewhere beyond the doors, the organist played the opening notes of Jesu Joy of Man's Desiring, and I stood there alone in my white navy dress uniform, gloved hands steady at my sides, 4 silver stars bright against my shoulders. A young chapel attendant glanced at me nervously. "Admiral Mercer." I smiled faintly. "You can call me Claire today." His ears reddened. "Yes, ma'am." He hesitated, then added quietly, "My mother served under you on the Roosevelt. She always said you were the finest officer she ever knew." For a moment I just looked at him. The sincerity in his expression touched something unexpectedly tender inside me. "Tell your mother thank you," I said. His smile widened. Then the music shifted. It was time. He reached for the brass handle, and the doors opened. The chapel seemed to inhale. 300 faces turned toward me all at once, and for the first few steps down that aisle there was only stillness. The soft rustle of fabric, the measured click of my shoes against old wood, the low breath of Charleston air moving through open side windows. I kept my eyes forward. That was years of military discipline. You don't scan a room when entering command presence. You move with purpose and let people absorb what they need to absorb. But even without looking directly, I could feel it. Confusion, curiosity, recognition from some, shock from others. A low murmur moved through the pews like wind through reeds. Because while many of Daniel's family friends recognized the uniform immediately, very few expected to see 4 stars, especially on a woman my age, and certainly not on the bride. Halfway down the aisle, I saw my father. Walter Mercer sat in the second row beside my mother, his face frozen in a confusion so complete it almost looked childlike. For once he had no polished reaction ready. His eyes moved over the stars on my shoulders, then back to my face, then to the stars again, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with the daughter he'd spent his life dismissing. Beside him, Vanessa leaned forward, her lips parting slightly. "What is this?" she whispered. Mother didn't answer. She was staring at me as though seeing me clearly for the first time. And then I saw Daniel, waiting at the altar in his black tuxedo hands clasped before him, his expression steady and warm. Not surprised, not confused, just proud. That smile reminded me to breathe. I kept walking. Then everything changed. Front row left side. Thomas Whittaker, 82 years old. Broad-shouldered despite his age, his silver hair perfectly combed his posture, still carrying traces of the command that had once shaped entire fleets. Retired Admiral Thomas Whitaker had the kind of presence that didn't diminish with age. Men still straightened unconsciously when he entered a room. As I approached, his face shifted. At first, polite attention, then recognition, then something far deeper. His entire body went still. Not ordinary surprise. Recognition of something impossible. His pale blue eyes fixed on the stars at my shoulders. And I watched understanding strike him with physical force. Slowly he rose to his feet. The motion was deliberate enough that nearby guests noticed immediately. Conversation stopped. Thomas Whitaker did not stand casually. At 82, every movement carried intention. He reached down, set his crystal water glass carefully on the pew rail, then turned toward the center aisle and looked directly at me. There was reverence in his face now, and something else. Memory. My pulse quickened. He stepped into the aisle. Someone murmured, "What's happening?" He ignored them. Instead, he walked calmly to the front lectern where the chapel microphone rested. The organist faltered into silence. The entire room watched. Thomas adjusted the microphone with one practiced hand. Then he looked out across the chapel. His voice, when it came, was deep enough to fill every corner. "Ladies and gentlemen," the room stilled completely. He drew one slow breath, and then thundered, "Everyone stand for the Admiral." For half a heartbeat, no one moved. Then instinct took over. Military men first. Retired officers. Veterans. Then their wives. Then everyone else rose with them, chairs scraping sharply against old floors. 300 people standing at once. The sound echoed like rolling thunder. Gasps rippled through the chapel. My mother rose slowly, trembling. Vanessa looked around wildly, trying to understand. And my father remained seated for one stunned second longer than anyone else, his face gone ghost white. Then even he stood. Because in that room, under the authority in Thomas Whitaker's voice, there was no other choice. The silence that followed felt sacred. Thomas turned toward me fully now, and before anyone could process what was happening, the retired admiral raised his right hand in a flawless military salute. The sharpness of it stole the breath from the room. Then, one by one, every veteran present followed. Rows of salutes lifted toward me. Perfect. Silent. Absolute. 300 people standing. Dozens saluting. And my father staring at his daughter as if he had never seen her before. Thomas lowered his hand, his eyes never leaving mine. Then he spoke words that would change everything. "Admiral Claire Mercer," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Now the United States Navy still stands because of what you did in the Pacific, and behind me somewhere near the chapel doors." I heard my father whisper, "My God." For a long moment no one moved. 300 people stood frozen beneath St. Matthew's vaulted ceiling, the candlelight trembling across their faces. Dozens of raised salutes remained suspended in the air, and all I could hear was my own heartbeat. Thomas Whitaker stood at the microphone, his face pale with memory. He looked older in that moment than he had even minutes before. Not weak, never weak, but burdened by the sudden weight of years. The kind of look men get when history rises unexpectedly to meet them. He swallowed once. Then he looked directly at me and said more softly this time, "You never told them." I held his gaze. "No, sir." He gave a slow nod as if that answer confirmed something he had long suspected. Then he turned back to the room. The old command returned to his posture instantly. For 82 years, Thomas Whitaker had carried himself like a man who understood duty. Even age hadn't taken that from him. He adjusted the microphone slightly and let his eyes move across the chapel. "Most of you know me as Daniel's uncle," he said. A nervous ripple of laughter moved through the guests. He did not smile. "But before that, I served 41 years in the United States Navy. I commanded fleets in waters most people here couldn't locate on a map. I've watched brave men die. I've buried boys who became heroes too late for the world to thank them." The room grew still again. Thomas drew a breath, and in all my years of service, I have met exactly 3 officers I believed were born for command. He turned slowly toward me. "Admiral Claire Mercer is one of them." The words seemed to hang in the air like struck metal. Behind him, Daniel's mother pressed trembling fingers to her mouth. Across the aisle, my own mother looked suddenly unsteady, as though the ground itself had shifted beneath her. My father stood rigid, his face empty with disbelief. Thomas continued. 7 years ago, the USS Theodore Roosevelt Carrier Group entered restricted waters in the Western Pacific under direct threat of coordinated hostile action. At that, a few retired officers in the room visibly stiffened. They remembered. Of course they remembered. The incident had dominated quiet military circles for months afterward. Publicly, almost nothing had been released. Official statements described it as a navigational conflict successfully resolved through tactical command. That was one way to describe it. The truth was very different. Thomas looked at the room carefully, as if weighing what could now be said. The Roosevelt was seconds from catastrophic engagement. Communications were compromised. Enemy targeting systems had already locked. A woman near the back gasped softly. Thomas's voice lowered. "My son was executive officer aboard that carrier." He paused. And when he spoke again, his voice roughened. "We believed he was already dead." I felt the old memory rise sharp and unwelcome. Salt, heavy air. Red emergency lighting. The low scream of failing systems. The impossible arithmetic of command when every option costs lives. I had been 27. Too young according to nearly everyone senior to me. But command does not ask your age when it places lives in your hands. Thomas looked back at me now with something close to awe. Lieutenant Commander Mercer assumed emergency tactical authority after senior command was lost. She made a decision no textbook would have sanctioned. His pale eyes gleamed. She moved directly into hostile range. A collective intake of breath swept the room. Yes, I had. Every protocol said retreat. Every calculation predicted disaster. But retreat would have exposed the carrier's vulnerable flank long enough for complete annihilation. So I had done the only thing left. Advanced, fast enough and hard enough to disrupt targeting lock and force manual recalibration. It gave the Roosevelt 6 minutes. 6 minutes to restore systems and fire defensive countermeasures. 6 minutes that saved over 4,000 American sailors, including Thomas Whitaker's son. Thomas's voice shook openly now. She saved an entire carrier group. The chapel had gone so silent I could hear the faint crackle of candle wicks. He turned fully toward my father then, and his face hardened. "Do you understand what that means, Mr. Mercer?" Walter's lips parted. No sound came out. Thomas stepped closer. "Your daughter was offered every commendation our government could lawfully bestow. She refused public recognition because classified details remained active. She accepted silence because duty required it." His voice sharpened. "And while this nation entrusted her with fleets, you mocked her uniform over dinner." The words struck like physical blows. My father flinched. Actually flinched. I had never seen that happen. Not once in 34 years. He opened his mouth again. Nothing. For all his practiced charm, all his easy authority, Walter Mercer had no defense against truth spoken plainly. Vanessa's face had gone white. She looked from Thomas to me and back again as though trying to reconcile childhood memory with reality. My mother began to cry silently. Not dramatic tears. The quiet kind women cry when regret arrives too late to disguise itself. Then Thomas surprised everyone. He turned back to me. And with visible effort, this 82-year-old legend of the United States Navy straightened to perfect attention. Then he saluted again. "This country owes you more than it can repay, Admiral." Behind him, every veteran present snapped back into salute, perfectly synchronized. The sound of sleeves shifting filled the chapel. It was the most profound honor of my life. Not because of rank, not because of recognition, but because after 30 years of silent service, someone had finally spoken the truth aloud. And there, standing among Charleston's old wealth and polished appearances, my father had been forced to hear it. Walter stared at me with naked confusion, as though searching his memory for every moment he had dismissed me, and realizing one by one what they had cost him. Then his face crumpled. Just slightly, enough to reveal the frightened old man beneath the pride. And in a voice so low only the nearest Rose could hear, he whispered, "Claire, why didn't you tell me?" I looked at him calmly. And for the first time in my life, answering him felt easy. "Dad, I said you never asked?" The silence after my words seemed to settle over St. Matthew's like dust after a storm. "You never asked." The sentence wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Some truths arrive softly enough that people lean toward them, and then discover too late that they've been struck clean through. My father stood motionless in the second row, his mouth slightly open, his face stripped of all the easy confidence he had worn for as long as I could remember. Walter Mercer had spent his entire life controlling rooms. He controlled business meetings with polished certainty, controlled dinner conversations with sharp humor, controlled family gatherings through that subtle pressure. Only powerful men seemed to master that quiet understanding that everyone else should orbit whatever mood they had chosen for the evening. And now, for the first time I had ever witnessed, he had lost command completely. The room felt it. 300 people stood suspended in that strange stillness where everyone senses history shifting, but no one knows what comes next. Thomas Whitaker slowly lowered his salute. The veterans followed. Then he stepped back from the microphone and looked toward me, offering a small nod. The floor was mine now. I drew one steady breath and turned fully toward my father. For years I had imagined this moment. Not this exact setting, perhaps not the chapel, not the guests, not the impossible public reckoning, but some version of this confrontation had lived quietly in the back of my mind for decades. In every version I'd thought I would feel triumphant, vindicated, victorious. But standing there now looking at the old man who had shaped so much of my pain, all I felt was sadness. Not sharp sadness, not angry sadness, just the kind that arrives when illusion finally gives way to truth. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically. Walter Mercer was still broad-shouldered, still dressed in immaculate navy tailoring, still carrying the handsome authority Charleston society had admired for decades. But the force inside him, the certainty that had always made him seem larger than life, had cracked. And beneath it stood only an aging man confronting the limits of his own understanding. His voice came rougher than I had ever heard it. "Claire," he stopped, swallowed. Tried again. "Why would you keep something like this from your family?" The old reflex was there even now. Shift blame. Make himself the injured party. Several years ago that question would have trapped me. It would have sent me scrambling to explain, justify, soften. Not anymore, I answered calmly. "I didn't keep anything from you." His brow tightened. "Yes, you did." "No, Dad." My voice stayed even. "You simply never cared enough to know." A quiet murmur passed through the chapel. Walter blinked hard as though physically struck. Vanessa stepped forward from beside him, her voice tight with disbelief. "That's ridiculous." She looked at me the way she always had when uncomfortable chin, slightly raised eyes narrowed with practiced superiority. "You can't seriously blame Dad because you chose to live halfway across the world and never tell anyone what was happening." For a brief moment I saw the little girl she used to be. The child who learned early that our father's approval was conditional, and who had spent her whole life performing for it. She wasn't cruel. Not really. Just afraid. And fear often wears the face of arrogance. I met her gaze. "Vanessa, do you remember my promotion ceremony in Norfolk?" Her expression flickered. "That was years ago." "Yes." I nodded once. "You and Dad promised you'd come." Her face changed. Not much, but enough. Because she remembered. Of course she remembered. It had been the day I took command of my first carrier strike group. One of the proudest days of my life. I'd reserved seats for my family. Waited for them before the ceremony began. Checked my phone between formalities. Nothing. Hours later, I received a text from Vanessa. "Sorry, Daddy forgot. We had brunch with the Pembrokes and lost track of time." "Congratulations, though." That was all. No call. No apology. Nothing. Vanessa looked away first. My father's face tightened. That was one missed event. It was every event. The words came before I could stop them. Not shouted. Not angry. Just true. And truth spoken plainly can silence a room faster than rage ever could. I took a slow breath. "You missed my academy graduation because Vanessa had a pageant luncheon." His jaw clenched. "You missed my first command ceremony because your golf club hosted some charity banquet." His eyes dropped. "You missed my promotion to Rear Admiral because you and Mother were in Palm Beach for a fundraiser." Neither of my parents spoke. The years hung there between us like laundry no one could pretend not to see. My mother wept openly now. Her shoulders shook with the kind of restrained grief Southern women spend lifetimes mastering. Still, she said nothing. That was her tragedy. She had built her whole life around peacekeeping so carefully that eventually she forgot peace. Without honesty was just surrender wearing pearls. Walter looked at her, then back at me, and suddenly he looked old. Not 68, ancient. Like a man seeing his life from the wrong end and realizing too late what mattered. His voice cracked. I thought. He stopped. Whatever defense he had meant to offer collapsed before it reached air. For several seconds he simply stood there searching my face for something familiar. Maybe the little girl who once chased his approval. Maybe the daughter who would rush to reassure him. But she was gone. And in her place stood the woman his neglect had accidentally forged. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. I didn't know. I held his gaze. And with more peace than pain, I answered. That was your choice. The words settled over him like judgment. Not cruel. Not loud. Final. And in that moment I understood something unexpected. This wasn't revenge. Revenge would have required anger. This was freedom. Because standing there in that chapel with 300 witnesses and my father's certainty in ruins, I realized I no longer needed anything from him. Not apology, not pride, not recognition, nothing. And somehow losing that need felt like finally setting down a burden I had carried since childhood. But I didn't yet know the hardest part was still coming. Because 20 minutes later, my father would find me alone in the chapel's side parlor and say the words I had waited my whole life to hear. The chapel slowly emptied into the warm Charleston evening. Guests drifted toward the reception hall in hushed clusters, their voices carrying that strange mixture of excitement and restraint people use when they know they've witnessed something unforgettable, but haven't yet decided how to talk about it. Through the open doors, I could hear faint music beginning across the courtyard. Glasses clinked, laughter rose carefully, almost respectfully. Life was moving forward. As it always does. I stood alone in the side parlor just off the chapel sanctuary, staring out the tall windows at the fading gold light stretching across the church gardens. St. Matthew's had always kept this room quiet. Even as a child, I remembered thinking it felt like the sort of place where truths ought to be spoken. Soft cream walls, a grandfather clock ticking in patient rhythm, a vase of fresh white lilies resting on a polished walnut table. The air carried that familiar scent of old wood and flowers beginning to open under evening warmth. For the first time all day, I let myself breathe. The adrenaline had finally begun to fade, leaving behind an odd stillness. Not exhaustion. Something gentler. Relief, perhaps? A lifetime of waiting had ended in that sanctuary. And now I wasn't entirely sure what came next. Behind me, the door opened quietly. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. My father had always entered rooms carefully when uncertain. A hesitation before crossing the threshold. As though permission mattered only when he feared it might not be granted. I kept my eyes on the window. For several seconds he said nothing. Then his voice came lower and rougher than I had ever heard it. "Your mother's gone to freshen up." It was such an ordinary thing to say that for a moment I almost smiled. Walter Mercer had always reached for practicality when emotion frightened him. "Yes," I said. Silence again. The clock ticked. Somewhere outside a woman laughed. Then he cleared his throat. "Claire." I turned. And for the first time in my life, my father looked afraid. Not socially uncomfortable. Not irritated. Not embarrassed. Afraid. His shoulders seemed narrower somehow. His face had softened under the weight of whatever this moment required of him. Even his hands, those large, confident hands that had built a Charleston real estate empire from almost nothing, hung uncertainly at his sides. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a language he had never learned to speak. For years I had imagined this moment too. My father finally coming to me stripped of certainty. Finally choosing honesty over pride. And in every imagined version I had believed I would savor it. Instead, seeing him this way only made me sad. He took a slow breath. "When you were little," he said, "you used to follow me everywhere." The words caught me off guard. He gave a faint, broken smile. "You were always asking questions. About everything. Why the sky changed colors at sunset. Why boats floated. Why old houses leaned after storms." His eyes glistened. "You wanted answers for everything." I said nothing, because he was right. I had followed him constantly as a child. Back when I still believed fathers naturally loved daughters. Back when I thought if I learned enough, impressed him enough, became enough, he would finally look at me the way he looked at Vanessa. With delight. He looked down. "I remember once you were maybe 9, you came running into my office with some little model ship you'd built." The memory hit instantly. Popsicle sticks. Blue paint on my fingers. I had worked for days. "Daddy," I'd said, "look, I made a destroyer." He had barely glanced up from paperwork. Then said, "That's nice, sweetheart. Why don't you go help your mother with something more appropriate?" I remembered the sting of it even now. He closed his eyes briefly. "I saw your face fall," he whispered. A tear slipped down my mother's daughter-trained cheek before I could stop it. He looked up sharply. "I knew I'd hurt you." That surprised me more than anything. All these years I had assumed he simply hadn't noticed. His face tightened. I noticed every time. The room seemed to tilt around me. He stepped closer. "Claire, I need you to understand something, even if it doesn't excuse anything." His voice shook. My father was a hard man. I said nothing. I knew enough of my grandfather to believe it. Walter stared past me toward the window, seeing decades backward. He believed weakness was fatal. Kindness made men soft. Praise made children useless. His mouth tightened. "And when you were born..." For the first time his composure nearly broke. You were so fierce, so bright, so certain of yourself." His eyes met mine, and it terrified me. I frowned. "Terrified you?" He nodded once. "Because I knew the world would punish that kind of strength in a woman." The confession landed heavily between us. He swallowed hard. "I thought if I made you tougher first, life couldn't." For several seconds I simply stared at him. And then the truth arrived. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Understanding. He had not withheld love because I lacked worth. He had withheld it because fear had made him cruel enough to mistake injury for protection. I spoke softly. "No, Dad." He looked up, and I said the truest thing I had ever spoken to him. "You were the hurt." The words struck him harder than anger ever could have. His breath caught. His face crumpled completely. And then Walter Mercer, the proudest man I had ever known, began to cry. Not politely, not discreetly. The kind of helpless, ugly grief men spend lifetimes avoiding. He covered his mouth with one trembling hand, and wept for everything he had broken. I stood still and let him. After a long time, he lowered his hand. His voice was shattered. "I'm sorry." No defense. No qualification. No explanation. Just truth. And somehow that made it enough. I stepped closer. Not to comfort him. Not yet. But to release myself. "It's too late for you to raise me," I said quietly. He nodded through tears. "But it's not too late to know me." His face broke again. And this time when he reached for my hand, I let him take it. Just for a moment. Long enough for both of us to understand that forgiveness is not forgetting. It is simply choosing not to carry yesterday into tomorrow. A knock sounded at the door. Daniel's voice came gently through the wood. "Claire, it's time." I looked once more at my father, and for the first time in 34 years, I saw not the man I had feared disappointing, but simply a flawed old man being offered one final chance to become better. Then I turned toward the door, toward my future, and my father followed behind me in silence. The evening light had softened by the time I stepped back into St. Matthew's sanctuary. Charleston sunsets have a way of making everything look touched by grace. Gold poured through the stained glass windows and stretched across the old oak pews in ribbons of amber and rose. Dust motes drifted like tiny lanterns through the warm air. The chapel had settled into a hush again. The earlier shock had passed. The murmurs had faded, and what remained now was something quieter. Reverence, perhaps, or maybe understanding. Daniel stood at the altar exactly where I had left him, waiting, steady as ever. When his eyes met mine, I saw no trace of surprise or prideful triumph over what had happened. Only love, pure and unshaken. That was Daniel's gift. He never needed my accomplishments to define me. He had loved me before he knew the full story of my career. Before the promotions, before the public announcement, before tonight's revelation turned me into something larger than life in the eyes of 300 people. To him I had always just been Claire, and after a lifetime of being either too much or not enough for the people who raised me, that kind of love felt almost holy. The organ began again softer this time. I took my first step down the aisle, and then something happened I hadn't expected. As I passed the second row, my father stood. Not because Thomas Whitaker had ordered it. Not because custom demanded it. He simply rose on his own, slowly, deliberately. And as I drew level with him, Walter Mercer lifted his right hand in a quiet military salute, perfectly rendered. He must have practiced it somewhere in those last 20 minutes. The gesture was imperfect in its precision, his elbow slightly low, his wrist not quite exact, but its meaning was unmistakable. Respect, not performance, not pride, recognition. For 34 years I had waited for my father to see me, and there in the warm hush of St. Matthew's Chapel he finally did. I paused, only for a second. Then I gave him the smallest nod. Not absolution, not dismissal, simply acknowledgement. His eyes filled, and I walked on. Some wounds never disappear entirely, but they do heal enough to stop ruling your life. That was what I understood as I reached the altar and took Daniel's hands in mine. His fingers were warm and steady. His smile softened. "You okay?" he whispered. I smiled back. Better than okay. And for the first time in my life I meant it without qualification. The ceremony itself passed in a kind of beautiful blur. The minister spoke of covenant and grace, of building a life not on perfection but on faithfulness. Daniel's vows made half the chapel cry. Mine nearly made him cry. When we promised ourselves to one another beneath the fading Charleston light, I felt something inside me settle permanently into place. Not excitement, not relief. Peace. The kind of peace that arrives only when you stop asking the past to become different and finally allow yourself to step forward. When the minister pronounced us husband and wife, the applause rose warm and full around us. And this time when I turned toward the congregation, I wasn't searching for my father's face. I didn't need to. That was the miracle. For most of my life, every success had carried an invisible question. Will this finally be enough for him? Enough medals, enough rank, enough sacrifice, enough proof. But standing there beside my husband, sunlight falling across my white uniform, I realized I had finally laid that question down. And in its place was something far stronger. I was enough long before he learned how to see it. The reception carried on late into the Charleston night. Laughter spilled across the riverfront lawn. String lights glowed in the live oaks. Jazz drifted from the bandstand while guests danced beneath the stars. At one point, Thomas Whitaker joined me near the terrace railing overlooking the water. He held a glass of bourbon and smiled toward the crowd. "You handled tonight better than most admirals I know would have." I laughed softly. Years of diplomatic training. He gave me a sideways look. "Number." His voice gentled. "Years of character." That meant more than I can explain. We stood quietly for a moment. Then he said, "You know your father will spend the rest of his life trying to understand what he nearly missed." I looked across the lawn. Walter stood near my mother beneath the lanterns, speaking more softly than I had ever seen. Not fixed. Not transformed overnight into some perfect man. Just trying. And somehow that was enough. I think I said carefully, "That's his journey now, not mine." Thomas smiled. "Exactly right." Later that evening, after the final dance, Daniel and I slipped away toward the garden path behind the chapel. The night air smelled of salt and magnolia. The city glowed softly beyond the trees. And for the first time since childhood, I felt entirely unburdened. Not because my father had changed. Not because the room had stood for me. Not because the truth had finally been spoken aloud. But because I had stopped needing any of it to know who I was. That's the lesson life teaches us if we live long enough. Some people may never see your worth. Some may see it too late. And some, if grace allows, may finally open their eyes just before the end. But your value was never waiting for their permission. It was yours all along. If this story touched something in your own life, if you've ever spent years trying to earn